Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a bit of a break and some nice lunch. It is a great pleasure to have with us this afternoon David Atkin, who is the CEO of the Principles of Responsible Investment. He is going to talk to us a bit about what they are doing and the role of GRI standards and in the space that they are working in too. I'll pass over to David, a fellow Australian. Who would have thought years ago we'd end up sitting around a table in Amsterdam, David, discussing sustainability reporting standards?
Correct. So thank you, Carol. So Carol's to blame. She's taught me many things. Which is actually probably worthwhile just starting there. So I was the CEO of an Australian pension fund, a superannuation fund, for 13 years. CBUS, it was construction workers, and we always understood the role we had as the custodians or the stewards of our members' money and creating value for them over several generations was part of our DNA. And when we thought about how we navigate creating value, how we understand risks and opportunities, and how we understand our footprint in the communities that we serve, we were very early adopters of transparency of GRI reporting and also integrated reporting, and have been doing an integrated report, GRI reporting for more than 10 years. And one of the reasons why we were so keen to adopt the standards that we were asking our companies to adopt was because we thought, well, if we're living in their shoes, we will understand better the challenges and the opportunities, be better advocates for the need for providing investors with sustainability information. So I've got some formal pieces I need to communicate, so I give you a proper framing of the PRI's work and how we think about GRI in the current environment, but I'm sure we'll get into a very interesting conversation in the Q&A section. The other thing, just to sort of mention, you're probably already aware of this, but the PRI is an investor association. We have 6 principles that our signatories sign up to, which is about integrating ESG into your investment processes, being transparent about it, reporting on what you do, working collaboratively with others. We have 5,300 signatories in 100 countries around the world. Initially we were started by the asset owner community, who remain a very important constituency. So there's about 800 of our members that are asset owners, and then there are 4,000 or so that are investment managers around the world, and then service providers in addition. So, thank you for joining me. So starting with the areas of alignment between the PRI and GSSB. Firstly, we think there's a continuum starting with significant impacts to get to risks and opportunities. It's widely understood that companies' sustainability risks and opportunities can follow from their impacts and dependencies. Although this is not the only source of risks and opportunities, it is one that companies must consider. The ISSB acknowledges this relationship within its IFRS S1 standard and subsequent guidance on materiality. And the integrated reporting framework thinking principles, which are now part of the ISSB, are based on a similar premise that risks and opportunities arise from a company's effects and dependencies on capitals. For a company to understand and report effectively on its sustainability risks and opportunities, it must understand its sustainability impacts and dependencies. PRI sees the value for investors in standards on most significant impacts being developed through a multi-stakeholder approach. When it comes to actually reporting impacts, not just considering them, there is a common misconception that investors only need information on companies' sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and only other stakeholders, civil society organisations, need reporting on impacts. But the truth is more nuanced than that. All investors need sustainability-related information to inform their assessment of companies' risks and opportunities. And many investors also need information on companies' impacts, depending on their approach to responsible investment. For instance, some focus on incorporating ESG risks and opportunities. Others look to address the drivers of financial material sustainability risks. And others still actively pursue sustainability outcomes beyond immediate investment value. Investors' demand for disclosure on sustainability impacts can be seen in PRI's own signatory reporting. For example, results from our 2024 reporting cycle, which will be released very soon, show that 75% of reporting signatories identify real-world sustainability outcomes connected to investments. And 60% of reporting signatories use one or more human and labour rights frameworks, the SDGs, the UNGPs, OECD guidelines, to identify the intended and unintended sustainability outcomes connected to their investment activities. With this information on impacts, investors can assess the true cost that companies impose on environmental, social, and economic systems, evaluate their alignment with sustainability goals and thresholds, consider how these impacts may contribute to systemic risks that affect the value of the entire investment portfolios. This is particularly relevant for so-called universal owners, such as sovereign wealth funds or pension funds, who invest across entire economies. As well, PRI's legal framework for impact report demonstrates that investors may need to assess this as part of their responsibilities to clients and beneficiaries. Therefore, investors should have a role in developing standards for companies to report on their most important impacts, and these standards should be developed with the investor data needs in mind. So, PRI is a global body, and we are supporting a GRI plus IFRS approach and see the need for a global approach. Investor demand for information on sustainability impacts also has implications for optimal sustainability reporting regulation. Now, some jurisdictions may wish to focus reporting on requirements on sustainability risks and opportunities, since all investors, responsible investors, need this information. We think the ISSB standards are well suited to this, and their adoption can provide investors with the comparable, high-quality reporting on sustainability risks and opportunities they need for decision making. However, as already noted, many investors also need information on sustainability impacts. The ISSB standards can elicit company reporting on impacts in some cases, but are less likely to provide investors with the impact reporting they need on sustainability issues beyond climate. To capture this information and meet the breadth of investors' data needs, regulators should build on the ISSB's global baseline with impact reporting requirements from the GRI standards, the most widely used sustainability reporting standards in the world. This approach is entirely in keeping, we think, with the ISSB's own building blocks approach. Now, the PRI has publicly recommended this in consultation responses to all regulators considering adoption of the ISSB standards, because a global approach is needed to ensure this reporting is comparable and high quality from portfolio companies in all regions. And good examples of this approach in practice. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives reporting standards are fairly well aligned with the ISSB standards and contain additional requirements on sustainability impacts and dependencies informed by the GRI standards. In China, 3 stock exchanges published sustainability reporting guidelines, and the Ministry of Finance is beginning to adopt new sustainability reporting requirements. These instruments are grounded in the ISSB standards, but also introducing more impact-focused requirements, leveraging the GRI standards. Further, these additions should be made without removing concepts or requirements from the ISSB standards. Additions are helpful, but subtractions are counterproductive and can exacerbate the lack of comparability in reporting for investors, cementing this in regulation as opposed to voluntary initiatives. This approach will provide investors with the information they need on sustainability risks and opportunities in a standard way, but also ensure that the sustainability reporting can meet the breadth of investor needs across geographies, strategies and mandates. Now, the PRI is also changing the way we interact with our signatories to reflect the different ways in which investors do responsible investment. Just want to spend a couple of minutes on this. The driving force was our growing and diverse signatory base requires clearer differentiation and tailored support based on their approaches, goals and levels of advancement. From the global signatory consultation that we did in 2022, the PRI found that more than 80% of signatories believe that they should be able to demonstrate their progress in terms more relevant to them. And our new pathways are a response to this, which will be publicly launched in a few weeks, providing voluntary step-by-step journeys for signatories to develop and progress their responsible investment practice. Supporting signatory progression is one of the 4 focus areas of our new organisational strategy. These were co-designed with signatories and peers. Signatory and peer organisations have been involved early on and have shaped the key content and principles of the pathways. They were conducted over 17 months and involved questionnaires, focus groups, interviews and written submissions from more than 800 signatories. And what they entail will include a one-stop shop for investor learning, where they can, 1, identify what to prioritise next in their responsible investment journey, 2, find relevant resources, initiatives, standards and regulations tailored to their RI objectives and progression stage, with a high quality content developed for signatories, with signatories aligned with main market standards and with dynamic updates to content to reflect the evolution of market practice. Your signatory portal to support signatories navigate the framework and access relevant content. It'll be targeted, involve voluntary reporting to support signatories to track and compare their progression activities against their peer group, and it'll all be held together within a pathways framework. What is the pathways? Well, there are 3, which cover 3 different purposes of objectives to guide signatories' approach to RI. The first, pathway A, maximise risk-adjusted returns by incorporating ESG factors. Pathway B, maximise returns by incorporating ESG factors and addressing drivers of sustainability-related financial risks. This involves deliberate pursuit of sustainability outcomes, such as reducing GHG emissions in the real economy in order to mitigate undiversifiable system-level ESG risks, such as climate change, that threatens long-term financial returns. These investors signal their intent by pursuing sustainable outcomes, usually with targets that describe their intent and with allocation, investee stewardship and policy engagement to back it up. And then finally, pathway C, it's there to meet financial objectives while pursuing positive impact. This involves deliberate pursuit of sustainability outcomes for reasons other than their effect on financial returns. And whilst some impact investors will naturally see themselves here, there are also investors as asset owners across various jurisdictions who, for example, care about the world their beneficiaries will retire into and recognise the intrinsic value of positive impact and outcomes. I would certainly put the fund that I ran, CBUS, into that camp. Now, there's no hierarchy between the pathways. They exist in parallel to reflect the diversity of our RI objectives that our signatories work within. And the insights behind these pathways were influenced by our legal framework impact project with UNFFI, and this work was researched by Freshfields and supported by the Generation Foundation. The pathways, in particular B and C, demonstrate a clear need for impact reporting standards. So as mentioned right at the start, we do see a strong alignment, therefore, between the PRI and the GSSB work. So stop there. That's enough of the formal kind of framing of the issues from our perspective. And I'm really happy to answer any questions, get any feedback, have a conversation with you.
Thank you very much, David. So whilst everybody's thinking about what questions they might want to ask. I'd just like to ask you a bit more about Pathway C. So do investors self-select which pathway they go in, and do they have to demonstrate that they really belong in that pathway? And with regard to Pathway C, what would that mean in terms of demonstrating that's where they rightfully belong?
So philosophically, the pathways is designed to reflect the fact that our signatory, there is no one way to do responsible investment. And we need to have an ability to support our signatories and improve their own practice and their own maturity curve in a way that makes sense to them. So having gone back into the signatory base and looking at what might be the sensible clusters of investment objectives, we arrived at those three. And so the tool is there to help you work out where you are and what you should do next. So it's less, so you opt in, right? You choose the pathway that makes sense to you. And then as we build the pathways out, this will not happen straight away, but it'll take us, we need to build the content, we need to people start to use the content. I think what will happen is they'll self-assess. And then we will provide the ability for signatories to then report, so they can then get benchmarked against the peer group that they've identified as most relevant to them. So there will be a feedback mechanism that will provide an ability for our signatories to say, okay, well, we're here and we think, and we can see we want to get to here, and we can see that those who are above us in terms of the maturity curve have done these things. We can accelerate our learning. So it's an educational tool, and it's about really we had this debate internally. Do we sort of lift the minimum standards and kind of use the stick, or do we use the carrot? And this is a carrot approach. This is trying to work on the basis that everyone wants to improve, and they just need to be given the right information that's relevant to their context to be able to then work out what the next steps are. But just the other point I would make is that when we did that survey, and I know it's a couple of years old now, we asked people to identify the way they thought about responsible investing. And so what we got, and the three definitions that were given were those: ESG integration, but identifying sustainability outcomes. Those two things, but actually taking action on sustainability outcomes. And what we got back was 30, 30, 40. And then we asked the question, well, that's your current practice, what about the future? And it went from 40% taking action on sustainability outcomes to 60%. And for asset owners, it was 70%. And even in the US, and maybe the environment's changed since, it was above 50%. So directionally, that tells us that investors are increasingly, as they get more and more sophisticated in their approach, understand that that the outcomes is part of their responsibility, and they're going to need to have the ability to assess impact. So directionally, I think that's promising.
Yes, you can, please. I do have more questions if no one else does, but I'm very happy for someone else to ask questions.
Yeah,
I don't want to be grilled by Carol, so.
So in the US and elsewhere, there's this debate going on about fund names and whether the names are representative of the fund's investment strategy. And, the SEC proposed rulemaking, and I think some of that has happened in Europe as well. It strikes me that these pathways might be a mechanism that would allow a fund to either demonstrate that its name is consistent with its investment strategy, or perhaps give it a, pardon the pun, but a path to do so. Am I following that?
Yes.
Properly?
Yes, I think I think that's quite possible. I think the other thing I should say though is it depends on it depends on the type of signatory you are, whether you're an asset owner or a multi-strategy asset manager. It's quite possible that you would select components of each of the pathways. So again, that's just trying to provide more value and more entry points, because the key thing we're trying to do here is map out best, there are the 3 pathways and then 3 levels. And so within those 3 levels, what's best practice? What are the case studies? So that you can see how others have done it. But I do think it will be an ability to sort of navigate some of this. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think ESG remains a relevant framing in many markets, but obviously in some it's less valuable. And I think part of the need here is that the acronym itself is collapsing issues, and it's the underlying issues that are the more important ones that from an investor's perspective, that you need to be able to understand the risks and opportunities piece. And they're not necessarily a continue. I mean, you know, what's happening in the E space is not necessarily. I mean, you can have competing or counter, negative complications from a social piece to the E piece. So personally, I think one of the problems that we've had is ESG has been productized, and the idea that you can have a single number that tells you something about a company, I think is wrong-headed.
Thank you, and for the purposes of the audio, that question. Our guest for the day. Any other questions? Okay, well, David, have you noticed a difference across geographic areas, and where's the most interest in the C category?
C category.
The impact category.
Oh, sorry.
The making a difference. The
Sorry.
pathway. Sorry. Pathway.
Oh, sorry.
I should
sorry,
use
I'm
your
trying to
language.
think.
Sorry.
Yes. So I think every jurisdiction, there is a cohort that the impact piece is important. Even in the US, right, where we're seeing much more pushback. What I would say though is that we're seeing obviously we're seeing the pushback in the US to the whole concept of climate and ESG and responsible investing and so forth. In Europe, the challenges are different. I mean, it's around the fact that Europe's shown leadership, gone first, but there's now a plethora of reporting that's really creating challenges for voluntary and mandatory that needs to be addressed. And then you've got emerging and developing markets where responsible investment is sort of is newer, and I find like there's a lot to be learnt, for example, in South Africa on the impact piece, because they're very aware of their. I mean, you've got a very sophisticated first world investment institutional capital market, operating in an economy that's emerging, that's had got many S challenges, and so some of the most sophisticated investment strategies in thinking about sustainability outcomes, I would say, would be coming out of South Africa. I think that we're seeing when you move through Asia, you've got Japan, you've got China, you've got Singapore, you've got emerging countries thinking about sustainability like Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam. There's some really India. I was in India last week. It's very interesting. It's very interesting because it's not, this whole lean into sustainability is not political in the sense that it's not being weaponized. People are dealing with the issues as they see. There is this element of pragmatism, which is people are saying, look, we're going to learn from what's happened in other markets. Our transition pathway will be different. Our economy is different. Our needs are different, but the trajectory is the same. But therefore, how we go about it does need to have its own nuance. But there's an element of pragmatism about how they're thinking about their own economic transitions. And there's also a level of more optimism, I think, and enthusiasm. So actually, I find it quite energizing to come out of those places and thinking, well, actually, there's so much, there's so much to do here, and there's so much they want to do. The regulators and the governments are talking in a really proactive, and the other thing is that the other thing that I would say is that the regulators are more inclined to bring the institutional investors into the room and say, we've got this problem, let's work it out together, which is a much better way of working out the right solutions. And they're learning from the mistakes of the developed world, which I think is great. So.
Fantastic. Jeff has a question.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, David, for the opportunity to meet with you and discuss, and for your opening remarks. One quick question I had when I was reviewing the pathways, immediately I thought, oh, won't a ton of funds have a broad range of answers, and won't they be, pathway A in some of their products and offerings, and won't there be pathway C and others, etc. Is it expected that there's just kind of one pathway per company, or is it broken down by offering, or what's the rub there, please?
So this is a learning tool, and it's not about. I mean, we've created a structure that we think logically follows the investment objective clusters that we saw amongst our signatory base. But we've got no problem if investors or signatories, investment managers, cherry pick what's important, what they'd say is relevant to them. So it could be something in pathway A that's around stewardship in public markets. And then there could be something in pathway C around infrastructure and impact that's relevant to another part of their strategy that they also want to demonstrate. So it's so I think, and I think one of the things that will be interesting is to see how asset owners engage with their asset managers about which pathway they've selected and why, and demonstrating where they are. Because I think that it's less about the PRI giving a score and telling, I mean, we would do some benchmarking against peer group. It's more about enabling the asset manager, for example, to demonstrate their progression, and for the asset owners to engage with their investment managers to say, well, are we aligned? Where do you want to be? How can we support you? Or if we're not aligned, what can we do about that? Because it's not, that's not meeting our needs from a mandate point of view. And it's giving them enough tailored information for that to be a more impactful conversation. So I don't know if that helps, Jeff, in terms of answering your question.
Yes, for sure. Thank you again, David.
Do you see any merit in a group of our team sitting down with yours and look at this tool and where there are links with GRI reporting so that they can encourage companies that they invest in to report on those aspects?
1000%. So one thing I did not mention in terms of describing the pathways is that when we populate the pathways, we don't just want to populate the pathways with our own work. We'll have best case studies of signatories, but we want to then use it as a reference point to draw upon other people's work, other frameworks, so we'll do the due diligence. But this is not about the PRI providing all the answers to everything. We might identify that someone does something in particular that's very specialised and highly valued to our signatories in a particular pathway, that we will then refer them to in the pathway. So the extent to which we can tie other the GSSB GRI GRESB into the as a resource that enables the signatories to know where they need to get support or they can get, you know, to get learning, then that will be part of the thinking. So the answer to that is, Carol, absolutely.
Excellent. I'm sure Bastian's just put that in our draft work program for next year as something that we will work with you on. Another question then, are you talking with national regulators, the likes of IOSCO, around what they can do in terms of mandatory reporting requirements to assist you with this process?
So, I mean, we went through a very, part of the pathways came out of a deep consultation with our signatories about what our 3-year strategy should be. And what came out of that was what I said, which is that there was no one way to do responsible investment. You need to be more nuanced and better and provide a different way to provide progression. People wanted the PRI to be, you know, they wanted having a global institution that covers all of responsible investment is highly valued, but they want us to be more focused on local markets, emerging markets in particular. Has been a priority that's come through that process. They want opportunities to work together in collaborative spaces. So if you think about what we do, we provide support to you as an individual institution to help you get better at what you do. We create convening spaces where you can collaborate with others to work on areas of common interest. We regionalise that so that it's relevant to your market. And then the fourth thing, it's probably the most important, and that is, you can do things individually and you can do things collaboratively, but actually we operate in a world of laws and regulations, and they will then ultimately determine what is possible. And our signatories have said very clearly that we want to see a world that policy that enables responsible investment, and that is also recognises the practitioner's perspective. And so the need for harmonisation and interoperability is really fundamental for the PRI to advocate on behalf of our signatories. So a lot of the fourth pillar of our strategy is stepping up our policy work around the globe, advocating for the right reporting standards that are the sort of platform or the benchmark or the base that everyone can use. And you know, we're also very keen to sort of step into, you know, so we've had TCFD, we've now got TNFD. I can't quite remember the next one. It's TISFD. Thank you. All of those, I think I mean, there's you know, you do worry about the kind of, you know, is there a plethora? But I mean, at the end of the day, they are responding to different issues that we would say investors need that information to make informed judgments about value creation.
I'm sure we could exchange information on how to approach regulators and which regulators are doing what on this. There are a number already that mandate GRI reporting or have requirements aligned with GRI reporting. So room for collaboration there too.
Absolutely.
Anybody else have any questions of David?
Can I ask one?
Oh, please.
Yes, this is Yan from China. I'm actually wondering what is the motivation of the signatures now to use PRI? How do you promote the use more broadly, especially in the emerging countries?
Well, I think the fact that you've got a global organisation that's able to bring together the community, that, I mean, one of the real values from a signatory point of view is that if you can get your peer group together, either in the market that you are in, or even more valuable is across market. So, for example, we took a Chinese delegation to Norway a couple of years ago on a study tour, and from both sides got an awful lot of value out of just sitting down and sharing kind of each other's contexts and challenges, but also what they had learnt in terms of their own practice. So that's a really good, and that's an example of that cross-market peer group convening. So But I mean, I think it's the reason why the pathways are so important, because it's providing more a better educational tool and a better opportunity to access learning. I think we do see, we've got about 1,000 of our signatories actively involved in various collaborative initiatives that we play the secretariat role. For things like Climate Action 100, which we share with others, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Management Alliance, Spring, which is the nature stewardship program that we run, Advance, which is our human rights stewardship program that we run, as a new one that we're doing right now, which is really interesting, is a sovereign engagement. So we had a number of really large fixed income signatories come to us and say, we've never done a sovereign engagement. And so Australia it had nothing to do with me because it was before my time, or Carol, but Australia was picked as the pilot. And so we got funding. And so we had, over a 2-year period, a structured engagement where investors came into the room with government departments, with 30 different government departments, and basically shared, so if the government has this policy goal around climate in Paris or the SDGs, then explaining how they were going to meet that policy requirement, and then having investors in the room saying, well, if you structure it in this way, this is more likely to get institutional capital to come in. So having that educational exchange has been highly valued. The valuation came out very strongly. And so we're now going to take that sovereign engagement to another 8 markets over the next 3 to 5 years. And we've got another 30 signatories who want to come and be involved in that next phase. So that's another example of value that we're providing. That's educational, but actually you know that policymakers don't understand how investors make decisions, and so putting them together is really, it's a very positive thing.
The bridge of the different communities, or from different countries, or from different marketplace together in the room. That's a value that PRI brings to the investors, and that's how you kind of get the business continuing going, right?
Correct. That is correct.
That's why you mentioned at the beginning also, it's important to get the policy makers someplace. That is the first strategy.
Right.
I think JAR could somehow go together in this process, right? Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. It's Robin Hodis from GRI. I was fascinated. You said that you very much valued the multi-stakeholder approach to building understanding of impacts and most significant impacts. And then you've talked about this bridge building with sovereigns and government. How are you bringing multiple stakeholder perspectives to investors?
Well, so for example, in some of those collaborations, Advance and Spring, we bring in civil society as part of the inputs. There's some advisory committees that sit and help guide the work of those initiatives. So we bring. I think we could do more of that, to be honest. But the model of having NGOs, for example, helping us think about how we engage and what the issues are that we need to navigate. These are really complex issues that you need to understand. So that's an example of how we do it.
Thank you. And perhaps I can ask Rebecca to give her perspective as somebody who's been involved in this process from the other side, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. This is Rebecca representing the investor constituency. So as investors, we have been reporting using the PRI framework, which has taken a lot of our time as an institution. However, it has also, the positive is that historically it has also forced us to look at our governance and policies and what we're doing in a different way, by virtue of having to answer those questions. So that was very positive because it's sort of this looking at yourself from a mirror in a way and seeing things that you don't usually see. So through the PRI report, we've also been able to improve many things of our structures and approaches. On the burden, which is quite a negative word for reporting, we really welcome, as we've mentioned, that it is decreasing. It is going to become easier, more straightforward, but it also that it will streamline and facilitate the different levels in which types of organizations might place themselves. And we think this is very positive and also aligned to what we are seeing in the wider sustainability and sustainability reporting world. I think anything that can be done to bring together or to highlight what's the word? It's not interoperability, it's not overlap. We need to find another word. Complementarity of reporting standards is fantastic, and I know it's very difficult to get there from a template perspective, but it's very useful for us as investors.
And Rebecca, how do you see that pathway, that link between Pathway C and GRI reporting?
Very difficult question.
Really?
Yeah. No, I think there's a strong link. I think, but I also think that we need to wait to see the first reports come out, so that we can draw a better conclusion and view.
The other thing to be clear is this will be a build process. This is going to be iterative. It's going to be dynamic, and we're going to update it on a monthly basis as we learn. So it's not going to be wait 12 months for another. It's going to constantly be updated. But I mean, I just want to make this, I guess, this reflection. We were talking about it earlier. I mean, it's a very challenging world that we're in right now, and our part of the world, in terms of sustainability, responsible investment, has become much more difficult for both, not positive and negative, but different. There are different reasons for that. We need to not lose sight of the fact that actually an awful lot of progress has been made in a very, very short period of time. I love citing the Ocean Tomo research, which in 1970, when they looked at the S&P, 80% of the balance sheet could be attributed to tangibles and 20% intangibles. That study done in 2020 was 90% intangibles and 10% tangibles. And so we know from an investor perspective that when we look at the balance sheet now, it doesn't tell us everything we need to know about risk and opportunity and value, the value of that company. And that's why what we're all doing is now, I call it replumbing finance. But it's uncomfortable because it's not all there in place now. We're sort of building the plane while we fly it. We know what direction we need to head in, what the journey, what the goal is, but we're sort of learning it as we go. And that's uncomfortable, particularly for professionals who've been trained to think about in a particular way. Nevertheless, I think if you look back over the last 20 years, it's amazing where we've got to at this point. And I think for me, gives me optimism about the next days, notwithstanding all of the headwinds.
It's an important goal, and I'm sure we're all agreed that we need to work together on it, and that we can get there together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions or comments for David? Bastian.
Yeah, maybe a comment and also idea for future collaboration. We have relied heavily historically on the relationship with UNPRI to look at this reporting piece. It was an earlier version of what we're standing up now in terms of financial service related reporting content as part of the GI body of work, where we more than 10 years ago collaborated with the UNPRI very closely. And now there's the more recent effort with the financial services work, where UNPRI has been absolutely pivotal in getting us access to the right experts. That's one. but also looking at the body of work that you've been developing over the years and how it can inform reporting for the sector. So there is an opportunity now, and you and colleagues are helping us already with the public facing opportunity to provide comment on the financial services content that is under consultation now. But there will be more that we can do, I think, collaborating on the implementation of it across the industry. And part of what you build with the pathways, and certainly the C, it fits right in there in terms of keeping the ambitions high, also for transparency while the membership or the part of the membership that wants to demonstrate that they're firmly in that space. So that is just something I would put on record in terms of capacity building and where the two organizations can definitely collaborate going forward.
Thank you. And a plug there for responses to our financial services to exposure draft. Thank you, Bastian, for not missing that opportunity. Anybody else? Okay. That was a very good discussion, David. Thank you. It's very interesting to hear what you are doing. It is very important. We know investors play a big part, along with many others, in the push to drive change, and responsible investors, those concerned with making a positive social change as well as getting positive financial returns, are particularly important in the global change process. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Good luck in building the plane as you fly.
Yeah.
And do keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation.
And if someone
I'll
could help.
leave you to continue your work.
Yeah.
Where we go? I know where to go. Yeah, I'm good.
We'll just take a couple of minutes and then move on to the next item. Thank you. Also, our next item is on the public sector research paper. I had hoped Jeff would be able to chair this session and to give everybody a break from me, but unfortunately he's not well. He's listening in, but not in a position to chair because he can't see us. Welcome, Miguel. You've been leading this research on behalf of the standards division, and thank you. You've developed this paper based on feedback that we gave you last year. Can I just ask for clarification? Somebody's pointed out to me that the agenda says this paper is for discussion. The paper said it's for discussion and approval. Can I just ask what you would like from us from this session?
So we had indeed this paper in front of you last year in May, if I'm not June, June. And there was feedback from the GSB, very focused feedback on certain sections of the paper and the recommendations. And we're now coming back with the paper, basically trying to close out the process of research that will inevitably lead then into other discussions that we need to have about prioritizing work on the public sector as part of the work program going forward and so on. But we're trying to close out that research phase for now, and look at this as something that we can potentially also leverage public facing in terms of messaging of the positioning of the GSB versus the nexus of public sector reporting and transparencies. So this is where we are. So an approval in the sense that we look to say, can we close this discussion here? Are there enough pointers to follow-ups in the work program and elsewhere? Because otherwise the other option would be to continue and say there's more feedback and we still need to tweak the paper and into another version.
Thank you. So you're looking for guidance on the specific recommendations in the paper, so you know where to take it. Thank you. I just want just a comment on the description paper there. The second paragraph, you say there were concerns from the Labour constituency around the benefits of developing specific sector standards and the proposal to broaden the business constituency to include the public sector. I remember concern coming from the business constituency. There may also have been concern from the Labour constituency, but when it came to thinking about the whether we should have a public sector constituency, the concern was broader than Labour. And I took it, one of the issues was, well, what does that mean for the composition of the GSSB as a whole? Now, that is a question that's not for us. This is a question on which we may have some input, but the supervisory board's nominating committee is the appropriate place to look at whether or not we should have a public sector constituency. So I think for us now, this is off the table. This is not something for this group to discuss. We can have a view on again, but we've already expressed one. There's probably not much point doing it again. What I will say is that in the global context, I think this work is strategically very important. The Public Sector Accounting Standards Board is at the moment consulting on exposure drafts, which look at sustainability from a financial materiality perspective. And this is because that's what their conceptual framework is. They have a conceptual framework for financial reporting. They don't have a conceptual framework for sustainability reporting. So they're looking at sustainability related financial reporting through a financial reporting conceptual framework. And we have submitted a response to their consultation, arguing that really for the public sector organizations, the reporting on impacts is critical because public sector organizations have an impact on people, the environment, and economies by their very mission. It's their mission to have such an impact. So that's why we're talking about really making it clear that GRI standards are there for public sector organizations to also use. We're very keen that they don't just get in the loop of thinking about this from a financial materiality perspective, given the nature of the work that they do. I'll shut up now and I'll pass it over to you, Miguel. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for the introduction, in which you have basically covered the first point that I wanted to make about how to put this in the context. This is item 8 in your documentation, a paper on the status of impact reporting in the public sector, which, as it was explained, now you have already seen it. This is a revival. We are bringing back the document that we have already presented and discussed in June last year. The background of this is that the GSSB had requested a research on this topic, noting the relatively lack of traction of GRI in this sector, despite the massive size of the sector, but noting also that we're not ready to engage in a project. So they request a research document that we presented and discussed in June last year. 3 points of three specific points that we took from that discussion, that we noted that there was broad support for the recommendation to exploring synergies with the public sector and for producing guidance documents. There was less clear on what were the benefits of developing specific standards for the public sector. It's true that the document itself is not very clear on what shape that sector standard could take. And as Carol said, there were some concerns about expanding the GRI constituency to include the public sector. In any case, Carol expressed that this may not be the venue to discuss this, and we have taken it out from the recommendations also of the paper. So that is now of the recommendation that we're requesting you to discuss. Other than that, there are very few changes or very few substantive changes in the document. We've edited a bit for clarity and readability. In June last year, we had only 30 minutes of discussion for a very, very complex topic. So that was a reason which we think now in an in-person meeting we may have more time for discussing these recommendations. Carol also mentioned the events that happened in the landscape, and notably the exposure draft of IPSASP, which means that this is a topic in which we are forced to act, or at least compelled to act by other actors. So I will just have 2 slides on summarizing the conclusions and the recommendations. The 4 points on the main findings. We did find that indeed there is less GRI adoption in the public sector than in the private sector. We do have an issue of data, and in the paper discusses what have been options to look at, but I think the evidence there is quite compelling. We did look at one specific corner, which are state-owned enterprises that quote in the stock exchange. In that particular case, we didn't think that they were any different from similar private companies, meaning that gap in reporting comes from ministries, local governments, that type of institutions, rather than from the Totals and Enels of this world. Beyond the adoption itself, we also saw by reading and talking to stakeholders that there is a perception that GRI is for the private sector. We know it's not the case. We explicitly say that in GRI 1. These standards are for all type of organization, but that's not how it is perceived. We documented specific challenges that public sector organizations face when they try to use GRI, notably the fact that many of their impacts come from the rules and regulations that they impose and policy, not from their own activities, and that is unique, and also that they have some specific mechanisms of accountability that they may clash with the framework of GRI. And finally, the large section of this paper is devoted to document the many different types of reporting that organizations in the public sector use. This is not really unique to the public sector. We know that private companies also do all colors and shapes of reporting, but we have seen a specific broad range, and within that we documented the increased popularity of reporting against SDGs in the public sector. Again, we see that some private companies do it also, but it has been specifically popular there. Those are main findings that I want to draw here. Jumping to the 5 recommendations that we have in the paper, which is where we suggest the discussion of the GSSB may focus. The first one is consider the perspective of the public sector while developing GRI standards. Sometimes we do develop this the standards paying no attention to certain peculiarities of the public sector, and we may create terminology and specific disclosures that are unnecessarily complicated. In fact, this is something that we are already implementing in the economic impacts project, including the specific inclusion of a representative of the public sector in the working group. But so this is already ongoing. I think this is an important part of what could be our future strategy in this field. The second is to develop a GRI standard for the public sector, focusing on general government, meaning ministries, regional and local governments, and other central agencies, which is different from the recommendation on number 3, which is that there will be sector standards for some sectors which are overwhelmingly represented by the public sector. Of course, the recommendation number 3, it's in fact almost cheating, because it's not a recommendation that comes from this paper. It's already in the work program of the sector program. I mean, there will be these sectors, but we want to point out here for completeness that a significant strategy would be to pay extra attention to the challenges of public sector institutions when developing a sector standard on education, on infrastructure, or on health services. The fourth is to provide guidance for organizations to report on their impact through the policies and regulations, which we have noted that this is a specific challenge. In that sense, maybe highlighting the connectivity of the GRI and SDGs framework, which GRI has been doing in the past years. It's not something completely new, but again, it could help public sector organizations in the area in which we think they are struggling the most with our framework. And the fifth, to increase engagement with the public sector. I noted that we included explicitly a member of the public sector in the working group of the Economic Impact Project. It is an exception. It has not been definitely the rule, and it may not be there may not be a reason to do it in every project, but we may find that when there are projects that there is a reason for doing it, we should definitely encourage that, and other types of engagements with the public sector. This is all that I want to say. As I say, I encourage Carol and the GSSB to discuss these recommendations, and I also note that we are requesting also the advice of the GSSB to eventually publish this document. Of course, this document is in the public domain as part of the documentation of the GSSB, but we could have a separate publication as a GRI publication of this document, excluding the recommendations for the GSSB, to state the position of GRI in this field. That's something similar to what we did with the digitalization paper at the end of last year, that was discussed in the GSSB, but then was also published later. So your advice on that front would also be welcome. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much. Perhaps what we can do is go through each recommendation in turn, bearing in mind that if the supervisory board were to decide that the public sector were to become a stakeholder constituency of GRI, numbers 1 and 5 would be very straightforward. If that isn't an immediate decision, then there's a consideration, of course, of whether and how we go about doing some of these things. So perhaps if we take the first recommendation, first of all, considering the public sector perspective in GRI standard development and other GRI activities. Did you have a proposal there, Miguel, that you want to speak to, or are you looking for further suggestions?
Thank you. Not really. We can explain here what we did in the economic impacts project and what we did in some sector projects in which we have a specific experience there. In the economic impacts project, we identified how public sector organizations were struggling with some of the most simple disclosures that we have in GRI 2011, which they were reporting on in a much less complete way that similar private sector organizations, simply because of the concepts of revenue, their budgets, their were not really matching that. So we provided some research from my office, and we also explicitly engage with public sector organizations in the working group, but also as peer reviewers, as part of our public engagement. So it was a combination of research and public and engagement of stakeholders on something that we explicitly identified as problematic. Many of the disclosures and recommendations that GRI standards do are not necessarily problematic. Scope 1 emissions are not particularly different in the public or the private sector, but some are. Another interesting example was in the sector standards. We, as you know, we have developed mostly standards for the extractive industries. And there again, we found that there was nothing particularly different for public sector organizations in their impact on biodiversity, in their impact of dealing with local communities, in their impact of dealing of occupational health and safety, but there was when dealing of things like payments to governments and corruption. And we explicitly gave a specific disclosure saying that state-owned enterprises may want to consider this and that. I don't remember exactly what was the wording, but it was an explicit mention there. So again, it was a question of identifying the peculiarities and then trying to act on them. That's our experience. Open to questions.
Thank you. Sorry, Charles. I'm slightly confused. Maybe I'm reading it too much into it. Between 2 and 3 recommendations, is it a new public sector standard, like we have sector standards already? Or on the 3, we're talking about specific standards that are existing and you want to add the public sector perspective? Because I think they're 2 different things. I think even if you develop a sector, public sector overall standard, you will have to have very different from a university education, for example, hospital or infrastructure, not for profit, can be private, publicly funded. So I think maybe you would some clarification on which direction. Yeah, thank you.
Did I answer? Yes, in fact, this comes to the beginning of this initiative. When the GSSB first requested us this research, it was on noting that on the list of 40 sectors for the sector program, there was no specific public sector. Now, there are things like education, health, or infrastructure among these sectors, which are a majority or a very, very large part of the organizations there belong to the public sector. So those sector standards have not been done because we are not there yet in the development of the sector program, but they will be done eventually, and that is part of the work program of the sector standard. And here, in fact, they are. I mean, the recommendation would be to dig deeper into the into the practice that I've just described with the oil and gas to look at the specificities of the public sector, with the caveat that they are very, very present. What number 2 refers to, and which was the observation of the GSSB back then, is that on top of these sectors that deliver specific goods and services, such as education and health, there is a general government sector that does policy coordination, and does on top of it deliver some of these of these services, and that is typically things like ministries or local governments or regional governments, in which there was no space for them in the sector classification, in the sector program. Now, we think that there is a possibility, and recommendation number 2 is to actually go for that and design a sector standard that covers those general government. Indeed, I mean, to make the border between what is general government and what is not, I mean, it would require very, very thorough thinking, and it's not immediate for sure, but that is the basis of that recommendation, that we think there is a space for a general government.
So number 2 is actually quite clear to me now. Sorry, I misread. So different types of jurisdiction, like federal government, local government as a ministry. So what, if I understand correctly, for number 3, you have education, health, infrastructure, which could be one for public kind of type of sector, because you can have private education, right?
Yes.
So you could have a university who are private and public. So you could separate those. Is that correct? Like you could have a public sector education and education also on the private sector.
Yeah. In our experience, on our limited experience on the oil and gas and mining sector, what we did was just specify a few recommendations that would apply only for the public sector within the same standard. That is open for discussion, whether if we apply this to a sector in which the public sector is really present, we would need another shape. But in principle, it's just one sector standard.
Oh, this is Yan. I think there's a lot of similarities between public sector and the financial sector. So, I mean, it's one big cluster with, I say that you have different types of public sector. As mentioned, general governance is one thing, and state-owned companies, some of them might be overlapping with the other GRI sector guidance already, and some of them might stand on their own education or infrastructure. So there might be a way, I'm just thinking loud now, that it's, if we're going to develop sector standard for public sector, it might be just similar to what the financial sector is doing, right? In parallel.
The private sector.
Oh, sorry.
Do you mean the private sector?
The financial, so we have the bank, the financial standard, sorry. So we have the 3 parallel financial standard, right? Yeah, we have the insurance, we have the banking,
Yes,
yeah. So they have some similarities, but they also have some kind of general common ground. So I think this have very much similarity in the 2. I think, yeah.
Maybe to come in here, I think in relation to the second recommendation, what we're saying is we could probably pool for general government around these similarities, right? Because as Miguel has said, many of these institutions in government also deliver services, and they're going deep on through policy or otherwise into one of the pockets of what government is doing for society. So, but it would amount to opening up as part of the work program, so to also tie it back to that. If we now look into the future, and we will have a discussion of the prioritization of the sectors that we are still scheduled to do, and we have different ways of attacking this now with the proposal that is in front of you, also with the interim a solution that we're seeking to explore. It would still be the question: do we want to add one specifically here for the general government? And out of the research phase, and also the vetting that has happened after the discussions last year, we say that there seems to be real demand for this, and there is something with some definitional things to be resolved, there is a cohesive piece of work that we could describe as a project.
Thank you very much. So Anne Lindsay from the International Transport Workers Federation. I suppose I just wanted to kind of raise one point specifically, Miguel, in relation to some of the feedback that I know had come from Public Services International as the global union federation. And that's the area where I think it's a really interesting project, and there's obviously value in taking this work stream forward. I'm a bit wary on the recommendations now that we're looking at now to say go with them in their exact form, if I'm honest. Because I think certainly from PSI, which has got obviously huge membership in public sector, they also raised specifically that there was a real need to look at public services, and that it's helpful that the paper differentiates between public sector and public services, and I think that's useful in the research paper, but that doesn't seem to be carried across into the recommendations. And I think as well, obviously we're looking at this in a political context where it's fair to say that as GRI we need to recognise that discussions around value and impact by both public sector and public services are highly politicised at the moment. So I think we need to give thought to that, because I think whilst we've talked about some of the similarities with other existing GRI standards, there come very, very big differences as well. And I think we've got to be careful not to overlook those. So I know Carol's made the point about like setting up other committees or institutions within GRI and where that takes place. But I do think we need to think really carefully about the expertise, the skills and the knowledge that we need to tap into in order to take this forward, because as we know, the public sector and public services, government and labour are not monolithic, and we need to be able to capture quite a lot of complexities if we were to take forward recommendations 2 and 3. And from our side, as I said, we really would be interested in looking at that public service angle. So I know there's a lot of huge issues there, but I think there is valuable work here. But I think from our perspective, it's really important to get those recommendations right for the next stage. And we'd also be really keen to discuss some of the broader points that PSI raised as well. Yeah.
If I need to react on the second part,
Yeah.
on the expertise and the skills, I believe the regular process of that GRI follows to look for the right set of stakeholders for every sector or for every topic standard, I think could cover that need. I mean, any sector standard that we do in general government would rely on a working group of experts and people from the sector and people in connection with the sector and stakeholders representing the constituencies of GRI that have a say and an interest in the sector. So I believe we should be able to follow your concern.
Yeah.
There on the first one on the public sector, it's true that we didn't specify it in the wording, but I think it should not be difficult, considering that in fact this fits into recommendation number 3, because what happens is that we are going to develop sector standards for some sectors which are considered also a public service, or that many parts of it are considered a public service, and that is why they overlap so much with the public sector. I think it should not be difficult to mention that angle.
Thank you. And I guess the way that you've been getting this expertise to date is through contacts at IPSASB, the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, through CITFA, the Public and Finance Professionals, the Public Sector Accounting Body, and perhaps through national audit offices as well. Are there other networks that you use to get this expertise on the public sector?
So far, it has been mostly IPSASB on the case of the economic impacts project, in which we have a member of them in our working group. In in the cases of the sector standards, for example, it was just the case that we had state-owned enterprises in our in some cases, simply going through the constituencies of investors, business, we just find the public sector representatives there. The answer to the question is that there is not really a structured approach, but that for each sector and topic, we just find them going through the general procedures of GRI.
We're currently going through the process of developing our work program for 2026 to 2028. The Standards Division had a discussion about it yesterday, which I was able to attend part of. So I guess the question is, can we approve that these first three issues, let's take the first three that we've been discussing, are put in the work program that goes out to consultation? If they're not in the work program, we'll get no feedback on them. If they're in the work program, we'll at least get some feedback from the management board, the supervisory board, and anyone that responds to the public consultation on the work program.
And maybe just in terms of process, what we would try to do is to bring back that discussion, because we'll discuss specifically the sector standards as part of the work program in one of the upcoming meetings and how we prioritize within it. And then we can bring back both the emphasis on public sector and for some of the potentially prioritized sector standards, but also that larger discussion about categorization and inclusion of public sector focusing on general government, and so we'll make sure that it comes back before it is then part of an exposure draft of the work program.
Yeah, maybe coming back, I think it's when GRI developed public sector supplements, and also we had an NGO sector supplement as well. There was a quite high interest among public sector to report based on GRI. Somehow, I don't think it's the case public sector are not reporting sustainability. And more like after making these sector supplements, it's mostly adopted by public corporations, especially UK NHS and national oil and gas companies, national utility companies, national land management company, and they actually adopted GRI for the reporting. Just somehow this general government section are not, having a difficulty. I think it's framing and how to report on this. And I like the wording of operational impact reporting, and which more like better define what this general government should report, because it's reporting on policy impact. It's different things. It's quite difficult, but also that's depending on the jurisdiction and how to report on this, or accountable for policy impact or not. But operational wise, it's how much they made a scope 1, 2 emissions, and how much they use water, and how much they employed, and so on and so forth. It's quite common, and then it can be recommended to the all the public sector authority, and should be able to report on this. And the other things was like about number 1 and 5. I think it's maybe we could engage public sector in terms of not as a reporters, but report users, let's say, because of like local authorities, ministries might be using the company belong to their regions and how much they are making the emissions and how much they are creating the employment and so on and so forth, then GRI report could be quite valuable to get that information. And that's also encouraging, by public sector using GRI reporting, which also encouraging the local companies to use GRI standard in a sense. So in that sense, I think it's quite interesting to engage public sector into this discussion as well. Thank you.
No, I wanted to say so. This is Igazuma. I just wanted to say, I mean, Tomo already touched on a few of the things, but perhaps just to call out the part on the framing. I think we've had lots of discussions before we've eventually considered that it could be put in the work program and wait for feedback. And I think that it's because the framing is not very clear, especially the point number one. If we were going to consider to put this in the work program, I mean, we don't have the luxury, or stakeholders don't have the luxury of asking, what does this mean, or what does this not mean? I think it should just be clear. If we're thinking the recommendation number one has to do with perhaps calling public sector integrating into our existing standards. You give the example of the economic impact and the oil and gas, and then perhaps calling out public sector. That could be easy or clearer for, I mean, someone whose first language is not English to understand that recommendation. And then recommendation 2 and 3, it just needs to be clear. This is what the recommendation is, and then see what feedback that we get. But I would certainly support recommendations 4 and 5, especially because of the value it brings to public sector when it comes to perhaps reporting performance on the SDGs, the UN SDGs. There's still some things that private sector can learn, because right now private sector is in a flux about how to report on SDGs. We did mention that. So we do have private sector companies using the GRI, and then we do have standards that help public sectors to report their performance on SDGs. That could be beneficial to both public and private sector. So I would support that one, but certainly the recommendations 1, 2, and 3 need to be clearer if we want to add this in the work program and expect to get some feedback.
Thank you.
Thanks. And just in relation to the response and the replies, it was very helpful. I would think it would be really important to explicitly include in the recommendations that we would need a more structured approach to engaging with public sector actors and sourcing expertise. Public sector unions, as I've said, PSI's obviously got lots of ideas. I think just because we are talking about something that is very different, I think oil and gas is quite different to a whole range of other public services. So I think whilst we might have had ways of working up till now, I think if we're serious about thinking how this could be incorporated into the work program, I think you have to have a structured plan for how to engage and set that out clearly. And I think that will then help to make sure that we're tapping into the right expertise and the right actors.
Maybe I can make a suggestion. Like if we lump together the first 3 recommendations here, and we agree that the team in preparing the discussions of the sector program for the coming 3 years, that we will come back and build on the feedback that we received today. So that in the work program, we actually set out some of the ambition, because this is what the work program will do. It will not have the answers to all these questions. It will just set out the ambition to put resource behind sorting these questions out. And we can use the input from today and flag these elements and give them a home in the future work that we're signaling in the work program. That's probably as much as we can achieve based on the research, based on the discussion, and then a connection point before we go for exposure on the GSB work program to bring that back in something public facing, taking note of the comments, also signaling why we would engage in that work in the first place, but also what are the particularities that we will pay attention to engagement, the nature of public services, these type of things, we can flag that up. I think we have enough feedback to do that and bring that back as part of the discussion of the work program.
Exactly. Thank you all. I think on those first three, we needed to get some input from the GSSB so that you know that you can go on and develop this and be clearer, as Anne has suggested, and get this in the work program that then goes out for consultation. So I think we can take from the discussion that the first three recommendations, we're happy for you to take to the next stage to develop further along the lines that Anne has laid out. Obviously, you weren't going to do that before you got the sort of initial yes, go ahead and think about it some more. So that's the first three. Then 4 and 5. Could you just explain to us what you mean by 4?
Yes, this is based on the recognition that the operational impacts and policy and regulatory impacts are different, and that public sector organizations struggle particularly with the second type. So here the recommendation is to acknowledge this separation, because the difficulty of that they have the GRI standards is that, of course, this is nowhere written in the GRI standards. When they look at the standards, they don't see this difference. And in our analysis of public sector reporting, some have taken them out, some have taken them in, some are mixing them, and I think to provide guidance. I mean, this is a recommendation of not developing a standard, but to provide guidance for the public sector on identifying that they are different and on pointing ways in which they can report on both of them.
Okay, so you're talking about reporting on the outcomes of policies and regulations and how they have impacts.
We're talking on exactly on pointing to them, for example, through the work that we have done in mapping the standards with the SDGs.
Okay.
On how public sector organizations can use these frameworks to report on their impact of policies.
Thank you. Yeah. The last one, I think, falls with all the others, but has anybody got any other comments on question 4? Or can we, on recommendation 4, or can we do the same and ask the standards division to develop their thinking on that so it can go on the work program to go out for consultation and get some feedback?
I would support that.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel. Second time lucky in this case. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so now we can have a longer break, which I think we all need. Thank you all very much. Let's come back 3:05-ish, and hear what Paul has to tell us. Thank you.
Recording stopped.